Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this pre-local conference of youth webinar. With a background rooted in environmental science and commitment to promoting sustainable agricultural practices, our next speaker, Ms. Tsaone Mokotso, embodies the spirit of change through action. As we delve into the intricate relationship between agriculture, food security, and climate change, her expertise becomes very invaluable. Through her engagement in promoting sustainable agricultural practices, Mme Mokotso's influence reaches far and wide. Her insights resonate deeply with the theme of our webinar, as she will guide us through the challenges and opportunities in ensuring a food secure future in the face of climate change. Tsaone, the floor is yours.
Good morning, colleagues. I'm joining the webinar from another conference, so it's a bit noisy where I am, but I'll try my best to ensure that I capture what I was assigned to talk about today. My presentation will look at the evolution of agriculture within the UNFCCC process. I was told today we're just mainly introducing topics or thematic areas, some call them agenda items, that we look at when we are in the space of negotiations. So I'm a young professional working in the climate action space. I've been following agriculture negotiations. I started last year at COP27 Sham. So I came into the program when a lot had already been done. So my presentation today will focus on the nexus between agriculture and climate change within our African context and the differences in circumstances and approaches when we get to the negotiating table, the journey that has been traveled over time, how we saw agriculture evolve within the process, and the relationship or the linkage between Substar and agriculture. And then I'll touch base on the Coronivia joint work on agriculture, which I believe was the landmark of agriculture negotiations within the UNFCCC processes. And then I'll look at the future of agriculture. Please, my apologies in advance if there's some background noise. We can move right along, and thank you, Louisa, for sharing my presentation from your side. Mainly when we talk agriculture and climate change within our African context, we think of smallholder farmers, we think of rain-fed agriculture, how there is low use of external inputs. This could be your seeds, your agrochemicals and fertilizer, land degradation or fragmentation, poor land management practices. And then we also look at agriculture as a key driver of deforestation. And then in some cases, there's issues of high post-harvest losses, which are currently estimated at about 30%. And then how agriculture in our context has a very low agro-processing capacity. Or for lack of a better word, I could say we haven't fully harnessed that side of the sector. And then how agriculture in our context generally has low productivity, given the context and circumstances of where we find ourselves. Now, when we get to the negotiating table, when we discuss issues related to agriculture for our next two countries, that is developing countries, the goal is usually centered around adaptation and adaptation co-benefits, because agriculture is a source of livelihoods for our people. And we usually focus on those smallholder farmers that I made reference to. And then key challenges, really, it's just how vulnerable the sector is, livelihoods, economies, due to the impact of climate change, thus ultimately threatening food security. So our interests are usually centered around means of implementation. And by means of implementation within the UNFCCC processes, we are referring to issues of technology transfer, capacity building, and access to finance. For you to do anything within the sector, you'd need some form of innovation, some form of technology. You'd need to be capacitated. You'd need some means in monetary terms or value to carry out whatever activities you want to carry out. So when we negotiate agriculture, we usually push for more resources and contribution from developed countries towards adaptation, action, and agriculture. Now, on the other side of the table, where you have your Annex 1 countries, their goal is usually centered around mitigation and mitigation co-benefits, because agriculture in that context is it's an industry, very large scale with automized factories. The push for profit, these high emissions, these issues of biodiversity loss and pollution, because at their level they do it at a large scale. So their interests are centered around issues of information and data. So when we get to the negotiating table, they usually push for more responsibility and commitment by developing countries to climate change mitigation. Remember, on the other side, we're looking at adaptation and adaptation co-benefits. So one may ask, how has agriculture evolved over the years within the UNFCCC processes? So in 1992, that's when the UNFCCC was established as an intergovernmental treaty to help stabilize greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. And then 1995, that's when we had our first COP, which took place in Berlin. 2 years later, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted. And within this process, there was nothing on agriculture at that time. The only period where we got to see issues related to agriculture being mentioned was in 2001, when the third assessment of the IPCC reported or concluded that the poorest countries could be the hardest hit by climate change. So this meant that our people who are heavily reliant on agriculture, they were more or less going to face challenges. So the next time or within the process when we heard of agriculture, Substar was requested to host some workshops to address scientific, technical, and socioeconomic aspects of mitigation of climate change. And then several session topics are related to agriculture, including agriculture, forestry, and rural development. So in a nutshell, just how issues evolved, agriculture within the process really wasn't coming out. The only time we got to start seeing agriculture gaining momentum was after that period of 2011, where the Substar was requested now to start giving attention to issues of agriculture, because the EU had brought it forward as part of the bunker fuels discussion. So they would talk about it, but it was just mainly in passing or mainly in part of the text. And even as part of the text, it was not sufficient enough. And you could imagine what that meant for developing countries whose economies are solely reliant on this sector or industry. Now, it's also worth noting that in 2012, 53 submissions came through with views on agriculture, and then 2013, there was the first workshop on agricultural adaptation. And then 2014, there was also a call for submissions and workshops still related to issues of agriculture. 2015, there was a workshop on early warning systems, and then 2016, there was a workshop on adaptation productivity. 2017, that's when now I would say things started shaping up within the UNFCCC, because a decision was passed on agriculture being adopted as part of the agenda through the Coronivia Joint Work on Agriculture. This was UNFCCC decision 4CP23. It's called Coronivia because at the time they were supposed to do it in Bali, and Bali is Coronivia is one of the places in Bali. So at the time they couldn't travel to Indonesia. So this meeting happened in Bonn during the SBI sessions. So the decision requested the two subsidiary bodies, being your SBI and SABSTA, to jointly address issues related to agriculture over a 3-year period. And that's how the KJWA was born. And when you talk to seasoned negotiators within the process, they'll tell you that was the groundbreaking moment for us, because now agriculture got the full attention it deserves. And then SABSTA and SBI were, through that decision, requested to consider 7 topics through intersessional workshops. And then the UNFCCC Secretariat was to prepare workshop proceedings, reports which were reviewed by parties, and conclusions and recommendations were prepared on each topic. It's also worth noting that the joint SABSTA and SBI were to report back to COP26 in November 2020, but due to COVID-19, COP26 was postponed to was postponed to November 2021. So the actual reporting on Coronivia happened last year, COP27 Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt. So because this was the first time agriculture was being discussed within the convention or within the process, focus was mainly on workshops and topics. So the topics that I previously made mention of that were discussed were centered around modalities for implementation for the outcomes of the 5 in-session workshops on the issues related to agriculture and other future topics that may arise from this work. And then there was also methods and approaches for assessing adaptation co-benefits and resilience, improved soil carbon, soil health, soil fertility under grassland and cropland, as well as integrated systems, including water management, improved nutrient use, manure management towards sustainable and resilient agricultural systems, improved livestock management systems, socioeconomic and food security dimensions of climate change in the agriculture sector, sustainable land and water management. So Coronivia was mainly centered around capacitating, sharing information, knowledge. So in a nutshell, we could say this landmark decision to bring agriculture into the conversations provided useful information on the latest research, national circumstances, the realities faced by farmers, the challenges and opportunities related to agricultural research, as well as development, ways of mobilizing for climate action in the area of agriculture and food security. You also know that agriculture is the only sector with its own agenda item within the UNFCCC. And then the workshops and reports improved awareness and knowledge on the impacts of climate change on agriculture, focused on the work of institutions, organizations, and stakeholders working on matters of agriculture and climate change. And it led to new activities and initiatives. So last year, the Secretariat gave feedback or a report of how the joint work has done over the years. Remember, it was a 3-year period, but due to COVID, it more or less stretched to 4 years. So one may ask, where are we now and what's the future of agriculture? One of the key outcomes that came from COP27 last year, particularly for the group of 77 in China, the AGN, was we need to continue the conversation of agriculture within the UNFCCC process. So the big question was, now that Coronivia is coming to an end, how then do we proceed with agriculture? So when we got to the negotiating table for the group of 77 in China, that is inclusive of your Africa, your Latin America, your Indias, and China also is a part of that. It's mainly a group of developing countries. So the main issue for us was when we negotiate, we need to make sure that work doesn't stop at just what Coronivia said to do. We need to now move to the second phase, and the second phase for us is implementation. The whole 3-year, 4-year period of Coronivia was just centered around workshops, talkings. Now there was need to move to something tangible, and that tangible part for us meant implementation. So the decision CP27 requested the SBI and the SAPSTA to establish a 4-year Sharm el-Sheikh joint work implementation of climate action on agriculture and food security. If you were following those discussions, you'd recall COP27 was an African COP, and the slogan was Together for Implementation. And the key thing for negotiating countries, particularly from developing side, we need to now move from just the talk that has been at the center of agriculture. We need to channel more resources into the sector, and we need to push for more buy-in and more interest at that level, because for us, agriculture is something we can't negotiate and take lightly. Majority of our people in our respective countries are heavily reliant on the sector. It's a source of livelihood. So the decision also called on the need to include implementation of the outcomes of the joint work on agriculture that was carried out through the KJWA and previous activities addressing issues related to agriculture as well as future topics, recognizing that solutions are context specific and they take into account national circumstances. In as much as we form one Africa or one block of G77 representing developing countries, we have different circumstances in our respective countries, hence the need to emphasize taking into account national circumstances. And then the decision also recognizes the fundamental priority of safeguarding food security and ending hunger in particular, and the particular vulnerability of food production systems to the adverse impact of climate change, hence finding the need for an enhanced climate action on agriculture and food security. Now, I recall there were issues of people saying we didn't address issues of food systems, particularly on the subject of agroecology. The fact that we have different national circumstances means that we are using different systems or different food systems in our respective countries. So the reason why we couldn't single out agroecology within the decision text was to ensure that it does not become prescriptive. We need to understand that what works for country A may not work for country B. So when we negotiate, we try to be open of that. Rather, instead of singling out the various systems that people may prefer or want to hear, you'd rather just combine them. So one of the key things that the decision CP27 brought forward was that we need to look for ways of how we are going to operationalize this new 4-year joint work that will be taking over from what Coronivia did. And then parties were also asked to submit topics of what they would like to see now going forward being addressed or discussed. And then there was also parties being requested to submit views on an online portal that will be established. And this online portal will mainly help link our farmers with various farmers from other countries, It will enable an environment for knowledge sharing. Really, the discussion around that was, as we transition into implementation, there has to be ways or means in which we could do that. And in a nutshell, that is just what the decision was speaking to. So in the interest of time, I think I'll pause here and open up for questions. It's quite an interesting agenda item to follow. It's also because if you recall, I did give an account of the differences in our circumstances and approaches when we get to the negotiating table. For the other guys from the global north, they look at agriculture as a business. And when you look at us from developing countries, we look at agriculture as a way of life. So there are always those interesting conflicting views, those interests that we need to follow. One thing that I also forgot to mention was just give an account of how the negotiation process goes. So usually a country would prepare their position, and then they would use this position to meet within the regional bloc. In our case, would meet as the AGN, and then from meeting as the AGN, we now will meet with a group of 77 and coordinate amongst ourselves, and then we go to the negotiating table. So it's a process that starts first internally in the respective countries, moves to the regional bloc, and then moves to the bigger bloc of the group of 77 in China. And then we now get to your SBIs or your COP now, where we get into the negotiation process. So I will pause here because I have to also quickly dash back to the meeting I'm attending this side and open up for questions. I hope I've done justice to the subject, just to briefly get to introduce what it's all about, how it has evolved over the years, where we are now and where we are going. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Metzaone. If if there are no questions, I think we can proceed. Halathe Masigara, is it a brief question that she can quickly answer about Aya to her meeting? I give you 30 seconds to ask the question. You can go ahead.
Thank you so much. I think we all understand that the impacts of climate change are stronger on countries with fewer resources and very low income. So my question for Ms. Taune is, I want to know whether there has been any fiscal or budgetary measures in place for this implementation stage that we're getting into, especially for us developing countries from the developed countries as of now. Thank you.
Okay, if you recall, Africa has been pushing for the polluter must pay principle. And now with a lot of conversations happening around loss and damage, within the convention itself, we see a lot of interventions or programs being launched. I remember last year at Sharm el Sheikh, the COP presidency launched the FAST program. I'll just get it was in partnership with FAO. So as the conversations are evolving, we are also seeing agriculture being discussed in certain rooms where decisions are going to be made relating to matters finance. And I know as we now move to the UAE for COP28, part of the reason why we couldn't even agree on certain things at the just ended bond sessions was because of what we were pushing for, that means of implementation. Means of implementation, we are referring to your technology transfer, we're referring to your finance, we are referring to your capacity building. That is what we are pushing for as the developing countries. And that is what the other guys from the other table, being guys from the developed countries, were resisting. they wanted to continue more with workshops. Even the topics that they had put forward as part of the submissions from the decision CP, decision 3 CP 27, their workshop submissions were centered around more topics. And we were saying we have done a lot of talking in the previous joint work. Now we want to move into implementation. So when you look at the submissions, because some of these you could get from the portal, they were centered on for Africa and for developing countries, because I know Asian did make a submission. Our submissions were based on that. How do we unlock the finance part, which we see as the missing element to improving the sector, improving how our farmers are doing things. So within the convention, we now see agriculture being discussed across various thematic areas, loss and damage being one of them. There's also the Nairobi Work Program. Agriculture is being discussed there. There's also agriculture being discussed in other avenues like climate finance. So what we were also pushing for was to open our minds and not just close ourselves to agriculture, but agriculture within other contexts. You also remember or know that adaptation financing accounts for only 24%. And what we are pushing for is adaptation and adaptation co-benefits. So through the negotiating table, we are trying to lobby and push for that. There's always going to be resistance, but we are also pushing. And I guess through constituencies like Yongo that push for more advocacy, this is one area that young people could tap into and literally, put or apply pressure through, because we need you guys. It's difficult for young people to get into agriculture because the sector is expensive. You need resources. We see people who are in agriculture in countries like Malawi, where cyclone hits, you lose your crop before you harvest. Those are the realities that you need to put forward or to present, so that negotiators can know this and are aware of this. One may say, but we do talk about them. The talking is never enough. We need to apply pressure, and for the young people interested in the subject area, I think if you pushed for advocacy, you could do it through, your creative skills. If you're an arts person, that there's an avenue around that you could use to push for more awareness and advocate for these issues. And you're right, we do need finance. And we also agree with you to say in the negotiation table, that's what Africa, also with their colleagues from the Group of 77 in China, are pushing for means of implementation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for giving the young people this opportunity to learn more about this very important topic. A re go fe sebaka o boele ko meeting wa gago. Re tla bonana gape at the main local conference of youth ka October. Re lebogile Mmetsaona.
All right, cool. Thank you so much, guys. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay. Yes. So just a quick wrap up of this. I think this was a really good conversation when it comes to context ya Botswana. It took us back home. Se re se ithutileng in a nutshell ko gore this conversation, this discussion, yeah, agriculture, it was a long time coming in order to shape it into the at the UNFCCC level. Re bone gape gore this issue was taken more seriously go simolola ka ngwaga 2001. That's literally yesterday. Gape re lemogile gore the least developing countries are the most affected, and yet they are the most vulnerable when it comes to the climate change effects. Se sengwe se Mmetsaona se buileng ke gore there should be more dialogue to that when it comes to this issue, and these dialogues which are happening still, they should be able to translate into action e bonagalang on the ground. The issues or the solutions, sorry, they should be based on context, local context, and national circumstances. Ke sengwe se segolo sa se buileng. And this is why we have, I think, opportunities like these ones where we are able to discuss the realities on the ground and also discuss the solutions which are relevant to the realities on the ground. Agriculture ke so se e leng gore mo Botswana se dira thata ke small farmers, and like Netsaone said, re rely more rainfall. So our agriculture is pretty much rain fed. Gape it's not fully harnessed. Already re na le low productivity. Already the sector is vulnerable to climate change. And then put into everything, this means that there should be more capacity building, there should be more knowledge sharing, there should be more dialogue with the farmers to know about their realities. There should be more coming from uh, researchers, there should be more coming from Yes, Metinaya Mabara at the group just made a comment, Ari, with implementation of certain interventions like online networks for farmers, how do we get it to the farmers who need it the most, but aren't really big on technology? Save that question for, thank you so much for that question. Let's have more of these discussions at the question and answer session.